You were never meant to hear this. You were never meant to know that behind one ordinary suburban door in California, silence was sharpened into a weapon. Imagine this, a child, strapped to a chair so long her muscles withered, a crib locked shut with wire mesh as if her existence itself was a crime. Her father keeping a stick close by, not to protect her, but to punish the sound of her own voice. And when rescuers finally found her, they thought she was 6 years old. She was 13, and she had no words. Her name was never meant to be spoken. The world would call her only one thing: Genie. This is not just a story about abuse, not just a tragedy of one family's sickness. It is a mirror into how silence becomes control, how institutions feed on suffering, and how even rescue can turn into another prison. Because what happened to Genie did not end with her father's cruelty. Once she was freed, the next cage was waiting. You see, the world dressed her story as science. Psychologists, linguists, doctors, they swarmed her like vultures circling something rare. They said she was an opportunity, a living experiment. Could a child learn language after childhood? Could science measure the very edge of human possibility? Genie's life became the battlefield for that question. And in that battlefield, she was not healed, she was used. This is where the darkness lies, not just in a father who silenced his daughter, but in the way a civilization of experts studied her, debated her, and then abandoned her, like a test subject who had outlived her purpose. I want you to feel the chill of that, because this is not simply history, it is revelation. The truth is that systems of power, whether in one broken home or in the walls of prestigious institutions, always hunger for control. They do not care for the individual. They care for the experiment. They care for the data. They care for the agenda. And what began in Genie's small, sealed room, dark, airless, filled with the stench of silence, was only the first layer of confinement. Once she escaped, the second prison was waiting. And that second prison tells us something profound about the world you live in. Because Genie was not only a victim of one man's tyranny, she was a victim of something larger, something you and I must confront. The machinery of power that feeds on innocence, that rewards silence, and that discards lives when they are no longer useful. This is where we begin, with a girl who had no words, with a silence that grew into a sentence, and with the question no one truly wanted answered. If the world can do this to her, what is it quietly doing to the rest of us? Step deeper now. We move from the moment Genie was discovered to the origin of her prison, because the cage around her was not built in a single night. It was forged over years, layer by layer, silence by silence, until her very existence was swallowed. Her father, Clark, was not born a monster. He was shaped into one. He grew up in the shadows of the Great Depression, his father dead, his boyhood fractured inside foster care and institutions that taught him only two things: fear and obedience. Those who raised him did not speak in tenderness. They spoke in commands, in punishments, in silence. And silence became the only law he trusted. But trauma rarely stays contained. A man who has been bent by suffering will often bend others to his will. For Clark, the natural sound of life, babbling, crying, laughter, became unbearable. Noise was not life to him. Noise was threat. Noise was disorder. Noise was betrayal. And so when Genie was born, her voice was not welcomed. It was an enemy to be crushed. He turned his house into a fortress, curtains drawn, windows blocked, walls muffled. Neighbors thought the family quiet, respectable even, but behind those walls, silence was not peace. It was control. It was the law of one man against his own blood. And here is the truth few will say aloud. Genie's suffering was not just her father's creation. It was enabled by a community that looked away. 2 of her siblings died in infancy. 1 brother survived, beaten but allowed a life outside. No agency intervened. No neighbor broke down the door. In 1950s America, the absence of sound was mistaken for stability. A quiet home was assumed to be a safe one. And in that cultural blindness, Clark found the perfect camouflage for tyranny. Understand this: silence does not only conceal abuse, it protects the abuser. Institutions prefer silence because silence means no paperwork, no scandal, no confrontation. And so the deaths of children passed without question. The beatings of a boy passed without report, and a girl's cries were muffled until even her voice was stolen. By the time Genie reached 20 months old, her life collapsed into confinement. A wooden potty chair with restraints by day, a crib sealed with wire mesh by night, arms strapped, legs bound, words forbidden. The few times she tried to cry or speak, her father struck her with a stick. She learned quickly that silence was survival, and so silence became her language. Here lies the dark psychology. A human being can be conditioned into erasing themselves. Remove stimulation, forbid connection, punish expression, and the mind folds in on itself. That is what Clark did to Genie. He engineered deprivation, not neglect, not oversight. Design, precision, a slow, deliberate suffocation of her humanity. But this story is not only about one man's madness, it is about how easily madness can hide when society is indifferent. Clark was not a king. He was not untouchable. He lived in an ordinary suburb surrounded by ordinary people, and still, no one pierced the walls. No one asked why no child ever laughed in the yard. No one wondered why silence hung over the house like a shroud. This is the first revelation you must hold. Evil does not require secrecy. It thrives in plain sight, so long as it wears the mask of normalcy. Silence is its shield. Silence is its camouflage. And so Genie became the perfect embodiment of what happens when a system chooses not to see. A child was erased while the world outside hummed with progress, with optimism, with post-war growth. While America looked to the stars, one girl was strapped to a chair in the dark, her universe reduced to four walls and her father's shadow. When we speak of darkness in history, do not imagine it as something distant, foreign, hidden in ancient ruins. It lives in quiet houses on quiet streets, invisible because no one wants to hear what silence really means. And when at last Genie was discovered, when her mother stumbled into a welfare office by mistake, clutching her daughter's hand, the world gasped. They called it monstrous. They called it unprecedented. But they were wrong. It was not unprecedented. It was the logical result of silence tolerated for too long. Genie's tragedy did not begin with her father. It began with every neighbor, every relative, every institution that heard nothing, saw nothing, and chose not to dig deeper. Her father built the cage, yes, but society allowed him to keep it locked. And this is where you must start asking yourself, how many cages remain locked today, disguised by silence, protected by the illusion of normalcy? How much suffering hides behind walls you pass every day? Because what happened to Genie is not only her story. It is the story of a system that thrives when you stop listening. When Genie was finally discovered, it felt, at first, like salvation. Her mother, half-blind and desperate, wandered into a welfare office with her daughter by her side. Social workers froze. They thought Genie was a child of 6, frail, drooling, unable to focus her gaze. She was 13 years old and weighed just 59 pounds. She fled when she walked, like a toddler just learning to move. And when they tried to speak to her, she had only 2 words. Stop it! No more! The world erupted in horror. Newspapers called her a feral child. Doctors declared it the most important case in modern psychology. A girl who had lived in silence, stripped of language, locked away from human contact. What could she teach us about the human mind? Was there a critical window for language, a point beyond which words could never take root? Genie was no longer just a girl, she was an experiment. At first, the rescuers wrapped their actions in the language of care. She was taken to hospitals. Specialists flocked to her bedside. They fed her, they dressed her, they observed her with fascination. But fascination is not compassion, and fascination can be just as cold as cruelty. Because every eye that studied Genie was not looking at her as a child. They were looking at her as data. Understand this. Institutions rarely see individuals. They see opportunity. And Genie, in her brokenness, was the perfect opportunity. She was unique, unprecedented, and vulnerable. She could not resist. She could not argue. She could barely speak. In her silence, they projected their ambitions. Psychologists debated whether she could learn language after childhood. Neurologists tested her brain as if probing an artifact. Linguists treated her every sound as a discovery to be catalogued. Genie became a battleground, not for her healing, but for academic dominance. Each researcher wanted to be the one who unlocked her. Each lab wanted to publish first. The vultures circled, cloaked in lab coats and degrees. And here lies the second prison. The first cage was her father's tyranny. The second was the hunger of institutions. She escaped one form of control only to be devoured by another, because once you are seen not as a human being but as a subject, your life no longer belongs to you. It belongs to the experiment. At the center of it all, Genie remained voiceless. She could make sounds, she could mimic words, but the years of silence had carved deep scars in her brain. Her vocabulary grew, but her grasp of grammar, the structure of language, remained fragile. Scientists published paper after paper on her progress, dissecting her every failure, every triumph, but none of them gave her what she truly needed: stability, love, permanence. Instead, she was passed like an artifact between homes, between foster families, between labs. Each move disrupted her fragile progress. Each transition tore at what little sense of safety she had. The girl who had known nothing but confinement was forced into the revolving door of institutions. She was not healed, she was consumed. And here is the darkest truth. When Genie no longer yielded answers, when the data began to run dry, the scientists lost interest. Funding dried up. Papers stopped. She was placed into foster care, where new abuses awaited her, different from her father's, but abuses nonetheless. The cycle repeated. Rescue became abandonment. Study became neglect. This is what power does. It cloaks itself in noble language, in the name of science, in the name of discovery. But at its heart, it is always hunger. Genie was stripped of her voice by her father, and then stripped of her humanity by those who claimed to help her. Both forms of silence were cages. Both were designed to control. I want you to understand the pattern. Institutions will always disguise exploitation as progress. They will tell you suffering is necessary for knowledge. They will tell you sacrifice is justified for the sake of discovery. But when you peel back the layers, what you find is the same hunger that drove Genie's father. The need to dominate, the need to possess, the need to control what cannot resist. Genie never became whole. She never received the life she was promised when the world first gasped at her suffering. Instead, she vanished into obscurity, institutionalized again, forgotten by the very system that claimed to save her. And so the second revelation emerges. Rescue does not always mean freedom. Sometimes it is just another kind of cage, painted in brighter colors, spoken with kinder words, but still a cage. If you hear nothing else tonight, hear this. When power discovers innocence, it will never simply nurture it. It will use it, and when it is done, it will discard it. Genie's life is the proof. Look deeper now. The cage may have changed its shape, but the principle remained the same. Genie's body was no longer bound by straps and wire mesh, but her soul was bound by the cold hands of science. This is where the shadows grow darkest, not in the cruelty of one broken father, but in the way entire institutions fed on her suffering while telling the world they were saving her. When the case of Genie reached the public, it was hailed as a miracle of opportunity. Here was a living test case, a girl who could prove or disprove the most debated theory in modern linguistics, the critical period of language. Could a child, starved of words beyond early childhood, ever truly learn to speak? Researchers knew this was their chance. Grants were written, careers were made. Genie's silence became their golden ticket, but understand what this means. To the institutions, Genie was not a child to be healed. She was a riddle to be solved, a question mark that could secure prestige and funding. Every smile she gave, every word she attempted, every failure to grasp grammar, it all became data points, numbers on paper, citations in journals. The human cost evaporated behind the glow of academic ambition. Consider the irony. Genie had been robbed of her voice by her father. Now, her new captors robbed her of her story. Her life became a footnote in scientific debate. They debated her potential, her failures, her brain scans, but never asked the deeper question, what does she need to become whole? Because becoming whole was never the goal. The goal was knowledge, and this is where the mask slips. Science pretends to be neutral, detached, objective. But there is no neutrality where power is involved. The labs that studied Genie fought viciously over access to her. Linguists and psychologists battled not for her well-being, but for control of her case. One team accused another of exploiting her for fame. Lawsuits were threatened. Careers were ruined. Genie herself was lost in the crossfire, a child caught in the machinery of egos. What does this reveal? That the institutions we are told to trust, the universities, the hospitals, the research centers, are not temples of truth. They are battlefields. And on those battlefields, the vulnerable are the casualties. Genie's tragedy was not just that she was abused in silence, but that her abuse was weaponized as leverage in power struggles. And here is a deeper truth. What happened to Genie is a pattern. Think of the Tuskegee syphilis experiments where men were left to die untreated so doctors could study disease. Think of the Cold War programs that dosed soldiers with LSD to map the edges of the mind. Think of children in orphanages subjected to radiation for science. Always the same story. The powerless consumed, the institutions rewarded, the truth buried beneath noble words. Genie's case is not an anomaly. It is a mirror held up to the face of science when it is stripped of conscience. And it asks us this question. If they could treat a child, frail, abused, voiceless, as a specimen, what would they do to you if it served their agenda? The darker revelation is this. Her suffering was not wasted in their eyes. It was currency. Each paper published, each debate won, each grant secured. Her silence funded their success. When she was useful, she was paraded as the case of the century. When she was no longer useful, she was abandoned, cast into foster homes where abuse returned in new forms. Science closed its notebooks. The world turned its eyes. And Genie vanished again, not into her father's prison, but into institutional oblivion. Do you see the pattern now? Power wears many masks. Sometimes it wears the face of a tyrant father with a stick in his hand. Other times it wears the face of a doctor with a clipboard. But the result is the same. Control over the voiceless, the consumption of the powerless, the erasure of the individual for the sake of the system. And here is the revelation I need you to absorb. This is not only about Genie. This is the architecture of control. It is how power operates, whether in homes, in universities, in governments. First, silence the voice, then claim the body, then use it for your own ends, and when it is no longer useful, erase it. This is why Genie's story matters. Not because she proved or disproved a theory of linguistics, but because she exposes the hunger of institutions. She forces us to confront the reality that the systems we are told to trust, education, science, medicine, are built not on care but on control. And as we descend deeper into this truth, you must ask yourself, how many Genies exist right now, unseen, silenced, consumed by the machinery of power? How many lives are being measured, studied, drained, and discarded in the name of progress? The silence is not gone. It has only evolved. And if you listen carefully, you can hear it pressing against the edges of your own life. You've walked with me this far. You've stared into Genie's silence, into her father's tyranny, into the cold hunger of institutions. And now we reach the threshold, the point where the story is no longer just about her. This is where the descent turns inward. This is where you begin to see the shadow inside your own world. Because here is the truth. What was done to Genie is being done to you, just in different forms. She was silenced with straps and sticks. You are silenced with distraction, ridicule, and conformity. She was studied as an experiment. You are tracked, measured, and analyzed by machines. She was caged in a small room. You are caged in invisible systems of thought, consumption, and control. Do you see it yet? Genie was the extreme, but not the exception. She was the exposed nerve of a society that thrives on silence, and you are living in that same design. Let's strip away the comfort. Every day, your words are monitored. Algorithms weigh what you say, what you search, what you buy, what you watch. Very keystroke is logged. Every hesitation is measured. You are not a man in their eyes. You are data. And like Genie, your voice is being fed into the machine, not to nurture you, but to feed the hunger of systems that will never care for you. Think of it. Genie's silence became the raw material for science to consume. Your attention is the silence they consume now. The hours you give to empty screens, the energy you pour into distractions, the way you are trained not to ask questions. This is the modern version of the cage. You are taught to sit quietly, consume what you are given, obey the rhythms they set. And when you step outside, when you speak against it, punishment comes, not with a stick, but with ridicule, censorship, isolation. Just as Genie learned that sound brought violence, you have learned that speaking truth brings exile. Silence is survival, and survival is what keeps the system intact. Understand this. Silence is not absence. Silence is design. Silence is a tool of control. Genie's father knew it instinctively. Institutions know it systemically. And now, silence has been industrialized. This is why Genie's story is not just history, it is prophecy. She was a glimpse into the blueprint, a test of how far silence can deform a human soul, a prototype of what happens when freedom of expression is stripped away. And if you think that blueprint was abandoned, look around you. The experiment never ended, it only scaled. I need you to do something now, not for me, for yourself. If you understand what I'm saying, if you feel this truth in your bones, then write these words in the comments below. Write them twice to carve them into your identity, to tell the machine you are awake. I break the silence. Write it once for Genie. Write it once for yourself. This is not engagement, this is initiation, because the act of speaking, even in a space designed to track you, is rebellion. It is reclaiming what Genie never had, the right to choose voice over silence. But hear me clearly. Once you speak those words, you cannot go back. The descent will not stop. You will begin to see what others refuse to see. You will feel the weight of truths the world once buried, and that weight will change you forever. This is the halfway point. Beyond this, the story is no longer about pity for a broken child. It is about revelation for the man listening right now. For you, Genie's cage was visible. Yours is invisible. And what comes next is the stripping away of the walls you never realized were around you. Are you ready to see them? Are you ready to confront the machinery of silence in your own life? If you are, then step with me into the next chamber of this descent, because what waits there is not comfort, it is recognition. And once you recognize it, there is no return. Now we move into the mechanics, the gears behind the cage. This is where the story stops being exceptional and starts reading like the instruction manual of control. Genie's prison was physical. It had straps, mesh, a stick. But control wears many faces. In our time, it is quieter, more polished, and far more efficient. Where her father used brute force, the modern world uses systems, psychological architectures designed to guide, to nudge, to compress you into predictable shapes. And once you recognize the architecture, you will see how close you are to the edge of a similar lock. Listen closely. The first principle of all effective control is to fragment identity. Clark Y used physical restraints to restrict Genie's body. The systems that surround you fracture your mind. They tell you who to be in pieces: a consumer, a worker, a voter, a follower. Each role is small, manageable, and replaceable. You are not allowed a coherent self that resists easily measured outcomes. A fragmented identity is malleable. It bends. It complies. And like Genie, you can be conditioned, not with ropes, but with rhythms. Rhythm is the second instrument. Her father enforced rhythm with punishment. Move, be still, make a sound, be struck. Today, rhythm is enforced invisibly. The buzz of notifications, the schedule of streaming content, the programmed cycles of reward and omission, they are all rhythms that train your attention. You learn to expect small spikes of pleasure for small acts of compliance. You are rewarded for looking, for liking, for repeating. These micro-rewards shape patterns of thought more thoroughly than a single strike ever could. They teach you to obey the pace set by machines. Third, compartmentalization. Genie's world was bounded. One room, a chair, a crib. Modern control surrounds you with compartments you think are harmless. Work-life balance boxes, news channels that never overlap, identities segmented across platforms. Compartmentalization prevents you from forming a holistic model of reality. When you never have a full picture, you cannot connect the dots. You cannot form outrage that sticks. You remain manageable. You remain predictable. Fourth, narrative capture. Genie's story was told by others, doctors, journalists, scientists, who framed her life as an experiment. Their narratives replaced her voice. Today, narratives are monetized and curated. Powerful entities feed you stories that orient emotions: fear, desire, envy, shame. The stories don't inform, they orient. They map you into behaviors that are profitable or politically advantageous. If you believe the story that comforts you, You will not dig for the facts beneath it. Your silence is purchased by a story you never realized was a leash. Fifth, the bureaucracy of care. Genie learned that people who claimed to help could also harm. The state, the clinic, the university, each offered sanctuary and then demanded compliance. Modern systems wrap control in compassion. They brand their instruments as therapy, as optimization, as help. Prescription is offered for the restless, apps recommended for the anxious, programs designed to fix what is considered deviant. But when care becomes standardized procedure, it is no longer an act of mercy. It is a method. Methods can be applied broadly, and methods can become prisons. Sixth, expertise as authority. Doctors and linguists were the priests who decided Genie's value. They interpreted her life through the lens of their disciplines. Today's experts do the same, but at scale. Technocrats, consultants, data scientists, behavioral economists, they produce models and then govern human behavior using those models. Expertise becomes a kind of moral cover. We are doing this because we know better. When expertise replaces judgment, the human subject becomes a variable, and systems built on variables are indifferent to suffering. Seventh, normalization of surveillance. Genie's confinement made any privacy impossible. The modern counterpart is far subtler. Cameras, trackers, metrics everywhere. Surveillance is framed as safety, convenience, progress. Yet surveillance produces predictability. When your patterns are known, your options are narrowed before you even choose. Predictability is the opposite of freedom. It is the same force that allowed a man to calibrate punishments in a dark room. Feedback loops that tell the controller what will work. The more they know, the more they can tune the system to keep you compliant. Eighth, ritualized humiliation. Genie was punished to teach silence. Modern sister. Mrs. Teach compliance through public shaming, cancel culture, performance metrics, and gamified approval. When humiliation becomes ritual, it serves as social enforcement. It signals what is allowed and what is taboo. Men retreat from speaking because the social cost of dissent seems unbearable. Silence becomes the rational choice, like a survival strategy in a family that taught a girl to keep quiet. Ninth, the slow erosion of agency. Control is patient. It does not require dramatic seizure. It values gradual reshaping. The first time you exchange a small bit of privacy for convenience, you hardly notice. The first time you accept a curated stream of thought as news, you hardly notice. Small acquiescences accumulate like rust. Over time, the mechanism of choice dulls. Agency is replaced by defaults set by others, and when the defaults are set, your rebellion has to be larger to have any effect. 10th, and crucial, the unspoken alliance of indifference. Genie's neighbors, relatives, institutions did not have to conspire actively to condone her suffering. They simply looked away, rationalized, or deferred to presumed authority. That same indifference is the lubricant of modern control. People prefer simplicity. They prefer to outsource moral complexity to systems. They prefer to trust experts, platforms, and institutions rather than take the discomfort of vigilance. Indifference is the social adhesive that keeps cages intact. This is not paranoia. It is pattern recognition. Genie's suffering was extreme, but it obeys the same logics that order our modern lives. Replace straps with algorithms. Replace a stick with a negative notification. Replace a locked crib with a closed attention economy. The outcome is the same. A person whose voice is reduced, whose choices are narrowed, whose selfhood is fragmented. And now the question that matters. Once you see these mechanisms, by them, fragmentation, narrative capture, bureaucratic care, expertise as cover, surveillance, ritual humiliation, erosion of agency, societal indifference, what do? Retreat into anger. Become a recluse? Or use that recognition as power? Power begins with sight. The moment you name the machine, it loses its invisibility. Genie's tragedy teaches us this. Silence is not inevitable. It is enforced. If you refuse the enforcement, if you refuse rhythm that trains you, narratives that numb you, rituals that humiliate you, then you reclaim margins of freedom. You become unpredictable. You become difficult to govern. This is where men often stop. They witness and console themselves into paralysis. Not you. You have come this far. The descent we are on is not nihilism, it is waking. Genie's story is a warning and a map. It tells you how cages are made, and crucially, how they can be unmade. Hold this knowledge like a blade of light in a dark room. Use it to cut through the soft cords that tether you. The next step is practical. How to reclaim voice, how to reassemble identity, how to disrupt rhythm. We will get to that, but only after we go deeper still. Because to dismantle a machine, you must know every gear, and knowledge without action is merely another way to be observed. Listen. We have passed through the outer walls. We have seen the straps, the mesh, the clipped syllables. Now we walk the corridors that come after discovery, the long, invisible punishment that follows public attention. This is where the wound deepens. This is where betrayal becomes a pattern, not a moment. Genie's life, after being found, was supposed to be restoration. Instead, it revealed a truth every man should feel in his bones. Rescue can be a promise wrapped in another trap. After the cameras left, after the papers printed their righteous outrage, something very quiet happened. The professionals who had claimed to protect her began to argue over what she was worth. Guardianship, custody, research access. These were not abstract legal terms, they were levers. Each lever pulled meant a note. Her movement in the life of a girl who could barely name a color. She became a contested resource. Her daily rhythm, who fed her, who bathed her, who sang a word into her ear, was negotiated in conference rooms. She became subject to appointments rather than attachments. Imagine waking from a long, dark sleep to find your body mapped and auctioned by strangers. Imagine a man wearing a lab coat telling you what future you are allowed to have. For Genie, the pain of confinement did not end when the door opened. The pain simply changed hands. One guardian replaced another. One academic replaced another. The clinic that promised safety insisted on tests, on observations, on controlled environments. Every promise of help came with conditions, consent forms, protocols, study schedules. Her days were planned like experiments. Her nights were measured in data points. A life should be more than a series of controlled trials, but for Genie it seldom was. This is the anatomy of institutional betrayal. When caretakers become claimants, when duty becomes property, when empathy is traded for access. And betrayal is recursive. Those who should have protected her, the people with credentials, the men and women sworn to heal, were the ones who ended up profiting from her failure to fully heal. The more broken she seemed, the more valuable the case. Progress in recovery threatened funding. Regression promised more papers, more headlines. The incentives were perverse. They still are. When systems reward spectacle, the spectacle persists. Do not soften that reality with excuses. The tribunals of science tell themselves they act in the name of knowledge. But knowledge, like wealth, follows the tracks of power. When the vulnerable are the only available subjects, morality becomes optional. Researchers rationalized absences of care by invoking objectivity. They catalogued her sounds while neglecting the human need behind them. They recorded her smiles and ignored the emptiness that created them. In the name of learning, they practiced a different kind of silence, one that erased the person in favor of the case study. And then there was the second abandonment, the foster system. If you think a different set of strangers would be gentler, listen to what happened. She was moved from one placement to another, each new home a fresh disorientation. People who took her in often visited her like curiosities, not like a child needing constancy. Some showed kindness, shallow, conditional. Others were cruel. The cycle of abuse, interrupted for a season by publicity, resumed in subtler forms. She learned that being rescued did not mean being safe. It meant being visible only until visibility lost its monetary or reputational value. What is the psychological map of a life like that? It is not simple trauma that heals with time. It is a topology of fragmentation. Language, so central to human reality, arrives late, incomplete, like a borrowed coat. Attachment systems are scrambled. Trust becomes a brittle resource. Memory is a puzzle with missing pieces. The person learns to anticipate abandonment, to expect the next hand that reaches out to be retracting soon. That anticipation becomes a kind of armor, one that both protects and isolates. It is the armor of a man who stops asking for help because he has learned that help is a negotiation, not a refuge. From the outside, people labeled her progress in neat stages: improvement, plateau, decline. They attached charts, made predictions, wrote reports. Inside, the reality was raw, a human being trying to build meaning from moments stolen by others. She practiced speech, repeated words, learned to name objects, small, miraculous things. But each step toward language was shadowed by the knowledge that her words could again be used to measure her until she was nothing more than a series of syllables on a page. This is the next truth you must hold. Visibility is a double-edged sword. Being seen can save you from immediate death, but being seen by the wrong eyes can turn survival into spectacle. The cameras that exposed her father also illuminated a marketplace of pity, and pity, when institutionalized, becomes another form of power. It allows the observer to feel superior, to file reports, to speak about the subject as if from a height. The subject, meanwhile, learns to perform within the contours of those expectations. Her silence is translated into value. Her recovery is negotiated as an achievement to be displayed. There is also another layer here: legal and bureaucratic violence. Decisions about her guardianship, about who controlled her visitation, about which researchers could be present. These were made in corridors where compassion seldom walked. Lawyers favored their clients. Administrators favored policies that shielded institutions. The human cost was collateral. The rules that should have protected her were written by people who rarely had to survive them. Rules, like locks, can be wielded to protect, but they can just as easily be used to keep a person within protocols that suffocate life. And so Genie's adult years were marked by a haunting invisibility. When the headlines stopped, when journals closed their files, she moved into the margins, sometimes into quiet homes, sometimes into institutions, sometimes into solitude. She was not merely forgotten. She was slowly erased from public responsibility. The moral obligation that rose, briefly, in the glare of attention dissolved into routine. That dissolving is the most dangerous thing of all. It is the signal that the system, whatever its outward promise, prefers not to be held accountable when attention wanes. What does this teach you? It teaches you that rescue must be defined by permanence, not by publicity. It teaches you that the right hand that lifts must also remain steady, not withdraw when the reward is gone. And it teaches you that institutions must be interrogated not only for their achievements, but for the incentives they set. If excellence is measured by papers, by grants, by exposure, then the vulnerable will always be the currency. This is not an argument for cynicism. It is a call to clarity. See how the pattern replicates: silence enabled, spectacle extracted, abandonment normalized. If you are to be the kind of man who resists this machine, you must learn to evaluate systems by their long-term commitments, not by their press releases. You must look at who stays when the cameras leave, because Genie's story ends not with a tidy moral, but with a question. Who will hold the world accountable when it chooses to call suffering a subject and compassion a case? Who will keep speaking when speaking becomes inconvenient? The descent continues. We have seen the cages, the mechanisms, the betrayals. Now we approach the point where you decide whether to be a witness or a participant in the machinery. The next section will show you how to refuse the performance and begin to reclaim not only your voice, but a new kind of responsibility. The further we descend, the more the air changes. You feel it, don't you? The weight of realization pressing down like stone. Up to now, Genie's story has been about silence, abuse, betrayal. But here, in the darker chamber of truth, we must widen our vision. Because what happened to Genie is not an isolated tragedy. It is a mirror. It reflects something hidden in the very structure of the world you live in. Think about it. A child stripped of language, locked away, silenced into submission. And then, when discovered, she was not healed but studied, not embraced but categorized. Her pain was not erased, it was commodified. Do you see? That's the shape of power everywhere. It is not enough for authority to dominate you. It must also extract from you, to take your suffering and turn it into data, profit, control. Now ask yourself, what is the difference between Genie in her chair, strapped and silenced, and you sitting before the glowing screen, trained by endless noise and distraction, told when to speak and what to repeat? You think you're free because your prison is invisible. But the silence engineered for her was not so different from the noise engineered for you. Both sever the root of true connection. Both leave you unable to form language of your own. Genie was punished when she spoke. You are punished when you speak truth. Genie was rewarded with scraps of food when she complied. You are rewarded with dopamine when you comply with trends, with likes, with rules you did not write. Her prison was a room. Yours is a culture of engineered permission. Different form, same essence, control. The institutions that claimed her, psychologists, universities, guardians, courts, mirrored the institution of her father. Different language, different symbols, same hunger for dominance. This is the truth no one wants you to hear. The father's stick and the professor's clipboard are branches of the same tree. One controlled with violence, the other with procedure. One silenced with fear, the other with protocol. But both reduced her to an object. Now, look in the mirror. Have you been reduced to an object? To a consumer? To a demographic? To a vote? Do you understand that the system looks at you as data first, human second? Genie was the case of the century. You are the algorithm's user. In both cases, humanity is stripped away and replaced with function. And the worst part? Most never notice. They accept the role. They mistake silence for peace. They mistake noise for freedom. This is why Genie's story is dangerous. Because if you truly hear it, if you let it sink into the marrow of your awareness, you cannot look at the world the same way again. You cannot scroll through your feed without wondering what cage you are sitting in. You cannot hear politicians speak without imagining the walls tightening. You cannot trust institutions without asking, whose silence are they feeding on this time? And here is where I stop you, because if you are still listening, if you have followed me this far, it means you are ready to step out of the comfort of surface knowledge and into the territory of transformation. But transformation is not free. It costs the part of you that wants to stay asleep, the part of you that whispers, don't look too deep, don't question too much, don't disturb the silence. You must kill that voice, right here, right now. And to do it, you must declare something. This is not just for engagement, this is ritual. This is the binding of your identity to. Oh, a new path. Write it in the comments, twice, so that it carves itself into the algorithm, into your memory, into the pattern of your next decisions. Silence is control. I will not be silent. Do it, not for me, for yourself. Because repetition creates imprint. Imprint creates identity. And identity is the weapon they never wanted you to sharpen. Genie never got that chance. You still have it. Use it. When you write those words, you mark yourself as someone who has seen through the curtain. And once seen, you cannot unsee. The descent we are taking is not into despair. It is into clarity. The darkness is not your enemy. It is your teacher. It shows you how power hides, how control disguises itself as protection, how silence masquerades as peace. In the next chamber of this descent, we will not only watch history, we will dissect the mechanics of psychological control, the same mechanics that kept Genie voiceless, that keep entire populations docile. You will see how patterns of abuse scale from a single room to entire nations, and you will learn how to break them, so breathe deep. The silence you feel now is not Clark Wiley's silence, it is not institutional silence, it is the silence before revelation, the pause before the blade cuts through illusion. We go deeper now, and when we rise, if you endure, you will never again mistake your cage for freedom. The further we fall, the more the patterns reveal themselves. Genie's father thought silence would preserve order. The researchers thought study would preserve knowledge, but underneath both was the same operating system, control. And if you think this belongs only to a madman's house or an academic laboratory, you're already caught. The same architecture governs cities, nations, and even the screen you're staring at right now. Look closely. Control has always worked on three pillars: deprivation, dependency, and distraction. Genie's life is the concentrated form of this. She was deprived of stimulation, of language, of touch. She was made dependent on the very people who were hurting her. And when she was released, she was distracted by endless tests, schedules, and guardianship battles that kept her from true freedom. Does that sound unfamiliar? Or does it echo in the rhythm of your own days? Deprivation today is not food or warmth, it's meaning. Men starve in a famine of purpose, stripped of rites of passage, told their role is obsolete. Dependency today is not a strap on a chair. It's your reliance on institutions that promise to take care of you while draining your power. And distraction, well, that is the loudest prison of all. Endless scrolling, endless noise, endless false choices. A cage so comfortable you don't even see the bars. Genie's prison was brutal and obvious. Yours is elegant and invisible, but here is the edge of the knife. Once you recognize the architecture, you can begin to break it. Awareness is the first cut. Resistance is the second. But resistance does not begin by shouting at the system. It begins by reclaiming what was stolen. For Genie, it was her voice. For you, it is your sovereignty. Understand this. Language is more than words. It is the ability to frame reality. Whoever controls language controls perception. Genie was robbed of it. She could not frame her own world. And what of you? Look at the slogans, the headlines, the labels repeated until you accept them without question. Political language, corporate language, therapeutic language, all designed to condition how you see yourself. If you can only describe yourself with the words they gave you, you are still strapped to the chair. Control also thrives on cycles of abandonment. Genie was discovered, studied, discarded. Each abandonment reinforced her helplessness. Look at the systems around you. Wars fought and forgotten. Workers discarded after use. Men left behind after giving their strength. Institutions rescue when convenient, then withdraw when unprofitable. You are not supposed to notice this cycle. You are supposed to blame yourself, just like Genie, who was blamed when she did not progress fast enough for her researchers' expectations. Now let me show you the darker truth. Abuse and control do not vanish with exposure, they adapt. Clark Wiley's domination collapsed the moment outsiders saw the bruises and the silence. But then came a second domination, institutional, procedural, polished. What does that tell you? That systems of control are hydra-headed. Cut one off and another grows. Tyranny does not die, it evolves. Which means the real battle is not against individuals but against structures. And what of structures? They are built from belief, from consent, from men nodding, complying, saying, "This is just how it is." Structures collapse when enough men refuse consent. That is why the system fears awakening more than rebellion. Rebellion is noise. Awakening is silence broken with precision. A man who sees through the lie cannot be used the same way again. That is the dangerous man. So I will ask you, will you consent to your own erasure? Will you sit quietly, absorbing the language given to you, living inside a cage painted with entertainment and convenience? Or will you reclaim what Genie was denied in? Did your voice, your ability to frame your own reality, your refusal to be reduced to a study, a statistic, a consumer? Here's the cruel irony. Genie's tragedy shows us what happens when language is stolen. But your tragedy is the reverse. Language is everywhere, but it is poisoned. You drown in words, yet starve for truth. She was starved into silence. You are stuffed into numbness. Both destroy the soul. Both must be resisted. And so the descent is nearly complete. You have seen the dark chamber of her confinement, the colder chamber of her abandonment, and now the vast underground hall of mirrored control, the place where her story and yours intersect. One child in a locked room reveals the blueprint of entire civilizations. Do not make the mistake of turning away now, because in the final chamber, what we uncover will not only change how you see Genie, it will change how you see yourself, your society, and your future. The deepest truth is not about what was done to her. It is about what is being done to you right now and how you must answer. This is the last chamber. The light is thin here, but what it reveals is unforgiving. You have watched a life be stolen, watched institutions feed on suffering, watched spectacle replace sanctuary. Now we stand at the edge of meaning. What do we do with what we have learned? How do we take a story so brutal it could crush the heart and use it as a weapon for truth? This section is for the men who will not let this end as another tale of outraged headlines and forgotten victims. This is for those who will carry the burden and turn it into a map. First, understand the final, terrible lesson of Genie's life. Rescue without stewardship is abandonment in a nicer suit. The moment the crowd disperses, the obligations that were loudly proclaimed evaporate. People congratulate themselves for having acted. Organizations close their case files. Policy papers get written and shelved. Meanwhile, the human being remains scarred, incomplete, needing a constancy that never arrived. That is the moral failure we keep permitting. Heroism as spectacle, duty as momentary theater. If you would be different, your responsibility is not to shout once and move on. It is to build whatever steadiness the system refuses to give. Second, realize that accountability must be built into systems, not applied to them as an afterthought. Genie's suffering persisted because checks and balances were weak, because neighbors assumed the normality of silence, because institutions preferred not to be inconvenienced by sustained oversight. The pattern repeats. Weak oversight invites cruelty, absent vigilance makes harm possible, and procedural loopholes become the doors through which abuse escapes. If you value freedom, you must value structures that enforce care. Independent monitors, long-term guardianship that prioritizes human dignity over research output, transparent audit trails for decisions that affect the vulnerable. Systems must be redesigned so that rescue is the beginning of a commitment, not the end of it. Third, let this story sharpen your sense of moral discernment. There will always be people who wear benevolence as armor while they pursue power. Learn to read the difference between language that liberates and language that exploits. When institutions speak of studies, ask who benefits. When experts demand access, ask who will remain after their papers are published. When social outrage flares, ask what remains the day after the cameras leave. A man who wishes to resist must be skeptical of narratives that conceal leverage with compassion. This is not cynicism, it is clarity. It is the discipline of protecting the vulnerable from becoming currency in someone else's ledger. Fourth, reclaim voice as a form of resistance. Genie lost language, and in losing it, she lost the ability to claim her own story. For you, voice is more than words. It is refusal. It is the act of naming what the system calls acceptable and altering it. Speak not only to be heard, but to change the conditions of being heard. Support those whose voices are vulnerable. Demand that institutions that step into people's lives do so under public scrutiny and with binding obligations. Use your platforms, small and large, to hold systems accountable when they trade care for prestige. Fifth, cultivate communities that do what institutions often fail to do. Preserve continuity and human connection. Genie's life needed steady people, those who would not leave when the headlines cooled. Real change requires networks of men and women who show up consistently, who build rituals of care, who hold each other to long-term responsibility. Repair does not happen in one public apology or one charity drive. It happens in the daily work of standing by someone when it's inconvenient, of showing up when no cameras document the act. Sixth, teach a new ethic of knowledge. Science and scholarship are noble when they serve humanity. They are vile when they use humanity as raw material. Raise the standard. Research that involves vulnerable people must be accompanied by guaranteed, enforceable plans for long-term welfare, by compensation that is not merely monetary but existential. Support, integration, lifelong guardianship when needed. If knowledge demands a living subject, that subject must first be treated as a person, with rights that outlast the paper. Push for legal frameworks that bind researchers to the future of their subjects, not just their studies. Seventh, transform outrage into institutional reform. When the public laments a failure, it must not be content with moral speeches. It must demand systemic change, laws that close the gaps that allowed the abuse, funding for oversight agencies that remain active beyond the news cycle, and cultural shifts that remove the prestige from exploitative practices. Use the momentum of anger to create immutable processes, watchdog organizations with teeth, binding transparency rules, and consequences for institutions that prioritize prestige over people. Eighth, practice relentless empathy that does not conflate pity with power. Pity is passive, empathy is active. Do not let compassion be a stage on which you perform. Make it the foundation of your life. When you see a person whose voice is damaged, your first instinct must be to restore their agency, not to claim their suffering as evidence of your sensitivity. Empowerment is the antidote to spectacle. Support policies and personal acts that return control to the survivor. Choices about care, about narrative, about future Empowerment undoes the old pattern where the vulnerable are made into problems to solve rather than people to stand beside. Ninth, build and teach resilience, not by hardening hearts into indifference, but by instructing men in the discipline of attention, courage, and responsibility. Resilience is not stoicism, it is the capacity to endure so you can continue to act. Teach rituals that build constancy, regular accountability circles, community guardianship, mentorships that last decades, not news cycles. These are the muscles that will prevent another child from being allowed to disappear into silence. Finally, hold the image of Genie as both a wound and a warning. Let it be the thing that refuses to let you sleep easy. Let it haunt your decisions. When policies are made, when budgets are allocated, when children are seen and unseen, bring her name, her silence, and the shame of forgetting her to the table. If you turn her story into a lesson, not a headline, you will have done more than remember. You will have acted. This descent into the forbidden ends not with despair, but with a demand that you become different because you heard what others would rather bury. If you are the man I speak to, you will not let this end with someone else's absolution. You will use the truth as a tool. You will keep watch. You will speak when speech is painful. You will hold institutions to a standard they have historically ignored. You will stay when the cameras leave. Genie's voice was stolen. The world took it, measured it, debated it, and then let the silence return. Your responsibility is to make sure silence cannot be the easy answer again. Make your life the kind of vigilance that lasts longer than outrage. Make your words the kind that outlive applause. And when you walk away from the story, do not walk away unchanged. Carry the weight, carry the knowledge, carry it like an oath.